Need more Grok Talk? Well, you can catch new shows Saturday mornings from 9 to 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Miss a show? Not a problem. Past shows are rebroadcast here daily from 9 to 11 a.m. Monday through Friday. Join us for 2 hours of unapologetic conservatism. And we're not just armed with opinions.
Rock Talk.
All right, welcome back to Grok Talk. Almost done. One more guest. Yes, we are playing this in honor of Mr. David Bowie, who passed away this week from cancer, I believe it was. And, of course, Alan Rickman died, and we talked about that earlier.
Oh, man, what a great bad guy.
And Dan Haggerty. So,
what a great bear guy.
He was a great bear guy. All right, we've had this gentleman on before. He's communications director for Club for Growth, and we love Club for Growth. We'd like to welcome to the program Doug Sachletben. Doug, good morning.
Good morning, guys. Thanks for having me on.
Sure. All right, so there was a State of the Union show this week, and we've had a little bit of conversation about it so far, but we brought you in to get some analysis of what it was that happened. Now, I didn't see it, but I've read a lot of commentary, and I have two questions, I guess. One, is there any point to these anymore? And two, was there any point to what Obama said?
I really saw that speech as, and I, was forced to be one of those that edits it and watch the whole thing. Yeah, but I really saw that as his way of sort of bookending from 2008. He came out, as we all know, as this candidate who promised hope and change, and how he would bring folks together. And a lot of the latter part of that speech was this theme of politics is broke, and there's this partisanship, and both sides need to come together. And my sense was a lot of it was just what he's done all throughout his presidency, which is kind of the blame-shifting model of here's why I didn't fulfill what I promised back in '08 of hope and change. It's because I came to Washington and was shocked to find that both parties don't all get together, and the fact that he contributed to the highly partisan atmosphere. I mean, that didn't come up in the speech, but it really was just a message of, you can go on from here and fulfill the rest of my dream if you all just come together, but we couldn't, and so I didn't get to do all I wanted to do. When, again, this is the guy who 3 days into office back in 2009, House leadership comes to the White House. They sit down to sort of map out, are there places we can work together on an agenda? And that's where the famous line comes out from him saying, I won, elections have consequences. Basically, a big get lost to the House Republicans. I don't plan to do anything that you're going to like because I won. And so he started that from day one, but now wants to, at the end of his presidency, to preserve his legacy, say, I would have done so much more, but, it's all the Republicans' fault for being partisan.
All right, he had like a laundry list of things that he did. I'm going to play some audio that I took a clip from somebody who did highlights of the State of the Union address, because I can barely stand to watch or listen to Mr. Obama. It's his fault that I can't. But I grabbed a couple of these, and I didn't listen to the speech, and I'm glad I didn't. But here's one of them.
If you doubt America's commitment or mine to see that justice is done, just ask Osama bin Laden.
All right, so
that's killer.
Yeah, he's still kicking the football or punting or doing something, or I don't know what he's doing.
I remember that great. It was swords. They had a sword battle, right?
He's got a bunch of these. He talks about defending Muslims from insults. He talks about how strong the U.S. economy is. He talks about the need to get out of money in politics. I'm awestruck at just what a ridiculous waste of time that whole State of the Union speech was.
And that the Club for Growth doesn't deal too much. We don't get into the foreign policy, but if you that initial comment there about Osama bin Laden. So, I'm inclined to give the military most of the credit there. Mm-hmm. But okay, so he was president at the time, and if it was Republican commander in chief, I'd probably applaud the action. So I'll give some benefit of the doubt. But what didn't come up is a lot of the problems that we're seeing are what's happened from Syria. And what about that red line, that firm line that he had laid down that was going to be the point that, we'd stand up and stop? And now you look at where we are, and we have a mess. And part of it's just this weak, fickle kind of, people look at America as no longer standing behind its word. And we didn't hear anything about that. Of course, that was that Tuesday night as well, when we didn't hear anything about the Marines that had been, or the Navy sailors, I should say, who had been taken by the Iranians at the time. That was ignored. So he, cherry picks, of course, just the handful of things. And like you said at the beginning, maybe this is just endemic of what's happened to the State of the Union. It's become more of a political speech of accomplishments than a real look at where the State of the Union's at.
What we can let's draw some economic red lines, since that's really more in the wheelhouse.
Reagan had red lines, and some Libyan jets turned into Libyan submarines, I believe. Remember the line of death?
Yeah, he did. So I don't know that there's anything of value in the State of the Union speech as far as economics goes, but is there anything we can learn from it? And that aside, where do we need to go? What does the next president need to do?
Yeah, quickly to look back, he made some comment, to the effect that, you're talking myth if you don't believe this economy is in recovery. If you continue to talk about it being weak and not growing, then, you're just making stuff up. And I'm roughly paraphrasing, but that's pretty close to what he said. And clearly there's been a lack throughout this presidency of being in touch with the working class and seeing where they are and how jobs are doing and what it's like being under the regulatory effect of this government. And people still, we're still seeing consumer spending still struggling, even though things are supposed to be so good. People are holding back because they don't trust this economy, because if anything, this president has just enhanced instability at every level and left people wondering what's ahead. And that goes to what the latter part of your question was, that to have a new president come in and be very clear about stopping the regulatory nonsense out of D.C., starting to take, if there is a need for regulation, analyzing its impact on the economy and being careful about any kind of implementation if it's going to have any effect on the economy, lowering tax rates, corporate tax rate, individual tax rates, showing that there's a serious, stable approach to the economy from the government's point of view, would go miles in helping small business men and women begin to make decisions to trust that it's going to finally recover after these years of this dragging sort of, 2% I think we saw last quarter in growth.
Sure. So the Club for Growth does a lot of work in research on candidates, whether it be congressional candidates, where if one is a member, one gets emails saying, such and such a congressional race coming up, chance to support a conservative, or Senate races, where you're pretty much in agreement with the Senate Conservative Fund on a lot of candidates. And then, of course, there's every 4 years there's your Presidential White Paper series, which these days has its own website. So I'm going to give that a plug, presidentialwhitepapers.com. And it's a project of the Club for Growth. And Doug, why don't you tell us a little bit about that, and maybe who in your mind is the most pro-growth presidential candidate?
Appreciate that. Yeah, Presidential White Papers, it was started back in 2008 with that presidential cycle, and now so this is our third time around of really just trying to give people an honest assessment of where these candidates have been, if they've voted or been governors and signed into law legislation, or have been private citizens and have written and spoken about tax reform, trade, entitlement reform, government spending, tort reform. Those are some of the issues. And essentially a lot of it is just a highly footnoted record of those votes, those statements, to let people begin to draw their own conclusions of where the candidates stand on these issues. And so the Club for Growth members really were big fans of Senator Cruz before he was elected, and the club's PAC endorsed him, and as well Senator Rubio and Senator Paul, believing that on economic issues and understanding that people will differ once you move off taxes, entitlements, and those sorts of things. On Rubio, Paul, and Cruz, people have different views on some of the other issues. But on those that I've listed, that those guys would walk the talk, and the PAC endorsed them and was instrumental in helping them get elected. And this time around, as we did our white papers and looked at the push against Obamacare by Senator Cruz, looked at the fight for tax reform by Senator Rubio, the budgets put forth by Senator Paul, and we've said in these white papers, these guys are the real deal. Now, obviously, Rand Paul hasn't caught on by any stretch in the polls, and so we would continue to point back to Cruz and Rubio and say, these guys are, when it comes to those sort of pocketbook issues and getting the government smaller, more limited government on these issues, those guys seem to be the real deal.
Yeah, we have other differences with some of them, notably the expansive military view of Rubio, for example, or his immigration views. But you're right, his economic activity in terms of taxes and growth has been phenomenal. Paul likewise, and Cruz, as you say, outstanding. I noticed your comments on a couple of the other candidates. I'd been tracking, for example, Dr. Ben Carson since quite early last year and attending his events. And I would occasionally be surprised at the somewhat woolly nature of his responses or the tendency to go off on a tangent while thinking on his feet. And so to read in your white paper the phrase all over the map, I think pretty much sums up what I experienced in person. And it's a shame because he's a really, really fine man, but he's not a policy wonk by any means.
You said it. I mean, you read his story and you listen to him on just straight from the heart kind of comments, and you're right. He's a guy that is certainly inspirational on a lot of levels. But I mean, you pointed out the problem that as we look back at his books, which it's one thing you should, by the time you're on a presidential campaign trail, you should have those answers generally nailed down. But when you write a book, you've got even more time to sit and be very careful about how you put forth things, or you make a speech at the National Press Club. And that's some of our stuff was drawn from that. And even there, it's just this sense of I don't want to say it's uncertainty, but it's inconsistency on views, where he desperately wants to be a free market, strong capitalist kind of guy, and yet gets to healthcare and wants to would ideally put private health insurers out of business, or at least regulate the kind of profits they can make, and what share of their profits would go back into a kind of another kind of healthcare for the greater for people who have disastrous kind of occurrences, to set up a program for that. And just there's these instances that come up in some of his writing and remarks that show that he does have, and he's said, a rather liberal background, and some of that still bleeds into some of these points of view where he allows for a bigger role for government than a lot of conservatives, a lot of libertarians would be comfortable with.
Yeah, I'm actually of the opinion that the fine doctor was hyped beyond his abilities by somebody who's profiting from this hype and from the money making that's easy to do from the people that are happy to support him. And I think now it's finally got to the point where that support is turned down, but along the way a very large number of dollars have come across the transom, and I suspect there's a cui bono question in there somewhere. I wish him a very fine retirement.
I have a friend.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Just furthering the same conversation. There was an article in National Review this morning, or maybe Breitbart, suggesting that the establishment is starting to kind of cozy up a little bit to Trump. And by establishment, they're saying the crony capitalist establishment. They're cozying up to Trump because they see that he might be someone they could work with because of his business background. He might keep the gravy train rolling a little bit.
Yeah.
But they are most afraid of Cruz because Cruz is going to just kick rear end and take no prisoner.
Yeah, as I said earlier, he's going to burn down the entire rat-filled, plague-infested warehouse in D.C. And that's a Richard Viguerie piece from the Conservative HQ.
What's our strategy around that issue in terms of letting people know that, or helping to advance that, the idea that Cruz is going to be the biggest fighter for limited government?
We're doing everything we can. The 603 Alliance, who held our caucus, at which Cruz won handily because, frankly, he put in the most effort, again, is doing what it can to assist the Cruz campaign. It's interesting, we're this late in the game, and there are 2 or 3 campaigns that haven't run any ads. and that would include Trump himself, Cruz. I don't think Fiorina's put any big money into ads yet either. I think you're going to see from all three of those.
Well, the Club for Growth ads, correct me if I'm wrong, Doug, in Iowa had a big impact, right, on the Trump campaign? Do I have that right?
Oh yeah, the Club for Growth ads are very impactful. Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did $1 million in Iowa. We did it over a 3-week period, so it really saturated. And if people recall, it was our ads ran into early October, and it was during the last part of those ads, and then the next coming weeks that Trump actually declined in the polls. It was Carson who was, as you were saying before, was heavily promoted and moved up. But until very recently, Trump has been in second place in the polls, and so we believed at that point that just telling people the truth about the views that he's held throughout the years, which when you talk about all over the map, I mean, he's been the king of that in terms of high taxes, still government paying for health care, and just the bailouts, trade issues, and eminent domain, which I know was big in New Hampshire, the power transmission line issue. We just felt like if people saw that, it would at least cause them to pause and say, is this guy really conservative? Maybe he's not. Maybe I like him for other reasons. Maybe I just like his strengths. But at least on conservative fiscal issues, know the record. I think when you talk now, when you look at this latest, I saw that piece in the Washington Post, when you look at the establishment, I guess here's the analysis I would give. This is the same group of folks, the Mitch McConnell crowd, who vehemently fought Ted Cruz and sought to undermine Ted Cruz when I would argue he came to Washington with an agenda that he campaigned on and fought for what he was elected to do in fighting against Obamacare and the spending. And this establishment side, the Mitch McConnell crowd, was more prone to line up with Barack Obama and walk into last year's budget debate by saying back in September that, well, we're taking a shutdown or any thought of that. That's not a negotiating tool. Basically, we're going to cave on this and let us to $1 trillion omnibus. So I'm hesitant. I can see the establishment doing this. If they're looking and saying, Trump's the guy we can probably make better deals with, Cruz is only going to upset the establishment down here, I can see where that mentality begins to move in. They'll line up with whoever it takes.
Yeah, I've seen this in 2 or 3 places, Doug. The intimation that the Washington establishment, after being, first of all, wanting to do everything they could to drag down Trump, and then kind of resigning themselves to the fact that they couldn't drag down Trump, and finally they're thinking this is the guy they can do a deal with and at least keep the gravy train alive. Whereas as Cruz, they're afraid of for the phrase I uttered earlier. It's fascinating, actually. So. Last quick thought: you've been rather critical of Carly Fiorina too. Her campaign speeches, especially this last year, kind of imply that she gets it, that she understands the problem with cronyism. But you researched her further back and were somewhat critical.
We were, and again, and some of this, and people will say the same thing in terms of Trump. I mean, people do evolve, they do change in their thinking, and sometimes for very good reasons. And certainly Carly may well have. I think the biggest thing we pointed out is Prop 13 in California was one of the greatest accomplishments in finally protecting taxpayers on spikes in property taxes. And there was a measure to undermine that, and she was on the wrong side of that issue. She, on her argument being that the schools need more money, education needs more money, and so therefore the protections of Prop 13 can go away, was troubling to us, and it was just something we pointed out particularly. And sometimes when she campaigned as a senator, she didn't really go back against that either. Some of these times when candidates evolve, what you love to see is at least a sense of rejection of what was a wrong position in the past or an acknowledgement that it was wrong.
All right, we're against a hard break.
Clearly been there.
We're against a hard break. Yep. Just quick contact information, and then we'll let you go.
Yep, love for people to check us out on clubforgrowth.org, and they can see all about us there, and I appreciate you guys having me on.
All right, thanks. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
You too. Thank you.
All righty, bye-bye.
From the CNHT studios in Concord, New Hampshire, just a few blocks from the New Hampshire State House, this is Law Talk.